Good evening, everyone. My name is Ware Harmon, and I'm the Executive Director of Town Hall Seattle. On behalf of our organization and our partners tonight at Third Place Books, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our live stream presentation of Elizabeth Ferrer in conversation with Laura Anderson Barbata. As we get underway, I want to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, and particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. And we thank you all for tuning in. Town Hall is sincerely grateful for the opportunity to invite Seattle audiences and well beyond into present tense exchanges of issues, ideas, and creativity, even when we don't get to do it in person. Town Hall will continue to produce online content throughout this fall and into the new year, and as circumstances allow, to even host live streams from our building. Meanwhile, if like me, you simply can't seem to find enough time in front of Zoom or YouTube, know that many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form under the header Digital Media on our website. But back to tonight's program. All in, it'll be around an hour, including a slide presentation and a conversation, followed by a Q&A with the audience. You'll use the Ask a Question field at the bottom center of your screen, and they'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. Know that you can also view the event both here on Crowdcast or over on our YouTube page if you want to utilize that platform's closed captioning feature. Town Hall adds new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming programs include a conversation with leading data visualization expert Alberto Cairo, tomorrow night actually, on how charts and graphs influence our perception and misperception of the truth. Conversation with authors Donna Mascolta and Cecilia Aragon on Latina women's struggles overcoming gender and racial bias. A journey with composer John Luther Adams on his experience making music in the frozen woods of Alaska. And a conversation, I should say, a discussion of the characteristics, what's the difference really, of the characteristics of strongman leaders with Ruth Ben Kiat and Virginia Heffernan, as well as upcoming appearances by astrophysicist Mario Livio, commentator Michael Eric Dyson, and conversation with Robin DiAngelo, the acclaimed theater director Andre Gregory. For more information on all of the above and plenty more, visit townhallseattle.org. Arts and culture programs at Town Hall are supported by For Culture, Arts Fund, Seattle's Office of Arts and Culture, and the Wincote Foundation Northwest. But as most of you watching tonight know, Town Hall is at heart a member-supported organization. We truly wouldn't be here without our members, and I want to thank all of you watching tonight. One final piece of infomercial. You'll want to see the work discussed tonight, and while the book release is set for January, we hope you'll consider pre-ordering your copy tonight from Third Place Books. Buy local, please, and just remember, maybe the things we love about this place from before the pandemic will still be around to delight us on the other side. All right. Elizabeth Ferrer, a writer, curator, and arts activist and administrator, is Vice President of Contemporary Art at BRIC, an absolutely terrific nonprofit art and cultural space and a powerful online convener located in Brooklyn. That's the BRIC in BRIC. Previous positions have included Director of the Austin Art Museum, Director of the Visual Arts Department, and Curator of Exhibitions Coordinator at the Americas Society, and Curatorial Consultant and Administrator at the Miriam and Ira D. Wallach Art Gallery at Columbia. She's a noted authority on Latinx art and photography, lecturing and publishing extensively. She's also contributed to a number of works on the subject, including A Shadow Born of Earth, New Photography in Mexico in 1993, and Lola Alvarez Bravo, which toured nationally and was featured at the Smithsonian in 2007. Her essays have been included in books and journals, including most recently Barrett Street Kids, Photographs by George Malav, 1968 and 69, published back in 2018. She's also published articles in Nueva Luz, Arts Nexus, and Photograph Magazine. Laura Anderson Barbata is a transdisciplinary artist whose work lives at the intersection of performance, procession, dance, music, textiles, costuming, papermaking, zines, and protest. It's a busy, bustling intersection. Her work's held in various private and public collections, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York to El Museo de Arte Moderno, Mexico de Efe. Her drawings, photographs, and projects have received awards from the Institute of Bellas Artes Ponca, the Lindbergh Foundation, the Carnival Commission of Trinidad and Tobago, and the New York Foundation for the Arts. Ferrer's book, Latinx Photography in the United States, A Visual History, is scheduled for release, as I mentioned, in January of 2021. It's the subject of tonight's talk, and it's a different sort of release for me to spend the evening considering something beyond this complex political moment and daring to look forward to an exciting future event. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Ferrer and Laura Anderson Barbata.
Thank you, Ware.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth Ferrer and Town Hall Seattle, for inviting me to be part of this event. It's an honor to be here with you to discuss and learn more about your book, Latinx Photography in the United States. It's an incredible book, and we'll get into details on your process and your research during this conversation. Felicidades. Congratulations.
Thank you.
My name is Laura Anderson Barbata. I'm a Mexican and Latinx artist, currently in Brooklyn, home to a number of First Nations people. I pay respect to elders past, present, and future, starting with the Lenape peoples, including the Manahatin, Canarsie, the Xicot, the Rawang, Merrick, Rockaway, Matinecop, Munsi, and the Sikh nations, all who have been and are caretakers of Lenapehoking, and to the native nations who occupied these lands, whose names have been erased through genocide. I met Elizabeth Ferrer in Mexico City in the mid-1980s when she was working on another amazing photography book, which was mentioned in the presentation just now by Weir, A Shadow Born of Earth, New Photography in Mexico. At the same time, she was also curating contemporary Mexican photography exhibitions that opened in conjunction with the Metropolitan Museum of Art's exhibition, Mexico, Splendor of 30 Centuries. Since then, I have followed her exceptional curatorial work and exhibitions that have traveled to numerous museums and have also followed her publications with great interest. In fact, Elizabeth, you might not know this, but I began collecting photographs of Lola Flores Bravo after seeing your book and the exhibition you curated on her work, who at the time was really under-recognized. I also had the honor of working with Elizabeth when she curated exhibitions of my work at the Americas Society in New York, as well as the solo show in El Orden del Caos at the Austin Museum of Art. Through the years, we have developed a friendship that on my part continues to grow with admiration and respect for her work, her arts activism, and her warm and generous engagement with artists of all ages, stages in their careers, genders, and geographies. Now, let's go to this, about your new book, Elizabeth. I consider Latinx photography in the United States to be one of your most important books in terms of research, and it's also a fascinating read. I could not put it down. I was riveted from the start all the way to the end. And that is not common to experience when reading a book on the history of photography. It's a powerful book. Tell us, why did you write this book?
Well, thank you, Laura, for that very generous introduction. Before I actually answer the question, I want to thank all the folks at Town Hall, especially Candace and Josh, who were troubleshooting up to the last moment. I want to thank University of Washington Press for making this book possible. And I want to give a shout out to you, Laura, because you are just an amazing artist, and maybe some people in the audience aren't familiar with your work. So I really do encourage everybody to look up online what Laura's been doing, because it's really extraordinary. And finally, I want to acknowledge that I am at the moment in Western Massachusetts and am on Muncie and Mohican land. So with that said, I was motivated to write this book really by a single fact, and that is that Latinx photographers have simply been excluded from the documented history of American photography. There has been no book up until this one. There have been no major museum exhibitions. These photographers are not taught in college courses. And I wanted this work to be better known. I didn't want the work to be lost. There's exceptional photography by these photographers, both in the current period, earlier in the 20th century, and really almost to the beginnings of photography. So there was much for me to cover, much to discuss. My book includes about 80 photographers that I profile. And, I think it's very important because, Latinx people, we make up something like 18% of the United States population. So the omission of this visual record from the history of photography means that the way that we understand the history of photography simply is not complete. These photographs, these artists represent really important dimensions of American life. And so I wanted to bring them together in this book as an introduction. I'm glad that you brought up my background in Mexican art, because in a way that really led to my spending so much time in the field of Mexican photography. As you know, at a certain point in time, I started traveling a lot to Mexico. I studied art history. I'd always wanted to be a curator. And when I was a pretty young curator in New York and trying to find my way, figuring out what I wanted to do, I realized I didn't know anything about Mexican art, the art of my ancestors. And at that time, there weren't many places to study it, not in New York at that time, although there is now. So I just started traveling to Mexico and meeting people. I discovered this really amazing art scene, one that I think rivals New York's art scene. People were very open and generous with me, and I was also kind of in the right place at the right time. You mentioned that I was doing these shows around the time of the Metropolitan's big exhibition. So I had the opportunity to curate all these shows that came to the United States, traveled to museums all over the country. That, of course, was a great experience, but as I just was, curating and meeting artists and learning more, both in the United States and in Mexico, what I began to realize was that Mexican photographers were better known in the United States than Latinx photographers. I could go to museums like MoMA and I could see Mexican photographers on those walls. There was a market for Mexican photography. I began to collect it, so I knew about that market. And at the same time, I realized we don't know anything about Latinx artists or photographers. They're not in museums, not being collected, not being taught. And so I thought, it's time to switch gears. It's time to really work with some photographers closer to home. There's an organization in New York called Enfoco. It was founded in 1974 by a group of Puerto Rican photographers. And so I began to do projects with Enfoco. If we could have the next slide. It's a wonderful organization with an incredible history of supporting Latinx photographers and other photographers of color. I'm showing you a couple of magazine covers of their journal, Nueva Luz. And on the left, you see this pioneering Puerto Rican photographer, Sophie Rivera. Sophie's probably in her 80s now. And then the other magazine features a photograph by Kathy Vargas, who's an important photographer, Chicano photographer in San Antonio. I wanted to show you these magazines because what's really important is that, or what was really lacking is the fact that these photographers really didn't have access to the media, to magazines, to gallery shows. And so Nueva Luz they started publishing their own magazine. They created their own collection. They started having their own exhibitions. It was at first a very grassroots exhibition, but it gave a grassroots organization, but it gave these photographers agency. It gave them a platform to begin to expose their work. And that's a platform that they simply didn't have, whether we're talking about New York photographers or in other parts of the country. Latinx photographers simply were invisible. So, Nueva Luz is very important and Enfoco is very important, but what I realized is that it was really just the tip of the iceberg. There's Latinx photographers all over the country who have been doing extraordinary work. And so I decided to delve into this history and start writing several years ago. The one other thing that I want to bring up about Enfoco is that what has motivated Enfoco since their founding in the mid-70s, what motivates Latinx photographers today, and even my work that I did in the several years of writing this book, is that there's this desire to hold up a mirror to our own communities. We want to be self-represented. We don't want to be represented by others. So this was also my goal. I wanted to talk about this art from my point of view. As a Chicano who was raised in Los Angeles. These photographers, they should be in photography books. They should be taught. And so I'm hoping that this book will compel other researchers to do more research, and for collectors and scholars and curators to understand that when we're looking at this work, when we're thinking about Latinx photography, this is really about American photography. This is an essential aspect of photography in the United States.
That's right. Yes, and hopefully this work, and I know it will inspire to expand that history and to include what you have found and for it to continue. I'm very interested in the research that went into this book. How long did it take? How difficult was it to find images?
Thanks. It was difficult. I mean, it was difficult to find images. It was often difficult to find time. I am a curator, as Ware mentioned, and I, have a professional position. So a lot of the work was done nights and weekends. I did a lot of research through so many ways. Kind of traditional library research, interviews with the artists, in some cases, interviews and conversations with widows and partners, because some of these photographers have now passed. Talking to people at historical societies. These photographs are not in the usual places. It's not like I could go to a museum collection and research that collection. So little by little, I began to piece together information and meet photographers. The internet was incredibly helpful. Going to a symposium of Latinx art in Chicago and meeting the one Chicago photographer who was part of the this 3-day event, and tracking him down and talking to him more. So it just was kind of a process of accumulating information. Also reading a lot of books about the civil rights era. So my original idea was to really talk about kind of the contemporary era, the last 2 or 3 decades. But the more I dug, the more I realized that there was a bigger story to tell. And so if we can have the next slide, I decided to keep going back in time, first to earlier in the 20th century, and then I found a few names from the 19th century, and then I found this figure. This is Epifania Guadalupe de Vallejo, and she's truly a pioneer. She was a photographer in the 1840s in California. Now, I present her in the book not because I'm saying that she is this great photographer that needs to be discovered, but rather she is an amateur, but she's emblematic of these lost names, of these lost episodes of in the history of photography. Just to tell you a bit about her, she was born in 1835 in San Francisco to a very wealthy family of landowners and ranchers. Her father was actually the last Mexican governor of the state of California. And when California became part of the United States, the family stayed. So basically, Fannie represents the first generation of Latinx people in the United States. We know that when Fannie was an adolescent, she got a hold of a daguerreotype camera. We don't know how she learned to use it, but she did. And she was responsible for some of the very first daguerreotype images taken in California. She probably stopped working with the camera when she got married, but there are a handful of surviving images by her, and they really represent some of the very first images taken in California, and certainly the first images taken by a Latina.
That's amazing. And your book really focuses on the 1960s onward, beginning with the civil rights movement. But can you talk about some of the earlier 20th century photographs that you discuss in your book?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, because there's this coalescence that happens around the 1960s and political movements and social causes. But there are some photographers in the first half of the 20th century, and they're also really pioneers, because there's really not much in the way of certainly in those days you wouldn't have said Latinx, but of an ethnic identity. They're making their work kind of in a vacuum, and they were real pioneers. So let me just show you a couple. The first one is Pedro Guerrero. He was a Mexican-American, and he's one of the 20th century's great architectural photographers. He was born in Arizona in 1917, and he's actually rare also in that he traveled to Los Angeles to go to art school. I think that was really rare for Mexican-Americans in those days. But when he came back to Arizona with his portfolio of photography, he met Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright had recently come to establish Taliesin West. Frank Lloyd Wright pretty much hired him on the spot, and he became Wright's exclusive photographer until the architect's death. So Guerrero photographed all of Wright's buildings. And he not only photographed the buildings, but the work of other modern architects, not only in Arizona, but around the country. And he also became a really well-known photographer of artworks. He was the photographer for figures like Alexander Calder and Louise Nevelson. This is just one more photo of by Guerrero, a portrait of Frank Lloyd Wright. And then if I can have the next slide, another figure who's really prolific in the mid-20th century, but not really well known, is Jesse Fernandez. He was born in Cuba in 1925, and he arrived in New York as a young adult. he had first studied art and kind of was going around these very sophisticated art and literary circles. But at a certain point in time, kind of around the 1950s, he decided to turn to photography. And he's actually the rare figure in that he became pretty successful. He was working for magazines like Time and Life, and he traveled all over South America. He started making classic portraits of well-known artists and writers. But he was also a gifted street photographer. And this in particular is not very well known work. This is just one more photo by Jesse Fernandez. And I think that, figures like Guerrero and Fernandez, they have big bodies of work. But they're just never mentioned in the same breath as other iconic mid-20th century photographers. And as you say, the book does focus on later generations, beginning with photographers of the civil rights era. And that's really important because a lot of things begin to come together at that time. The 1960s is when photography is beginning to really be seen as on par with other art forms. It's beginning to gain monetary value. You see the first photography museums being established around the United States. We also start seeing a critical mass of Latinx photographers. The 1960s is really the first generation when Latinx people begin to go to college and get degrees, advanced degrees from art school. And this is also when the first substantial generation of Latinx artists are really beginning to work essentially with the civil rights movement. But I did want to show these other photographers from the 40s and 50s because there is this whole history that begins, really with Fannie Vallejo that just has not been documented at all.
Right. That's true. The book, my experience with the book, and I'm sure for everyone it will be the same, it really takes hold of the reader from the start. One page into your preface, and I was immediately moved by the importance of your book, of the book, and not to mention the timeliness, which, as you say, you didn't plan it for it to come out now. You've been researching for this book for several years, but it comes to us at a very, very important time in our society. Latinx photography in the United States, your book, traces the history of civil rights movements and activism in this country. The book is not only the history of Latinx photography, but of the very important Latinx presence and contributions in the fight towards equal rights and justice. Both the history of photography and the history of civil rights activism cannot be told without recognition of the role of Latinx communities.
Yeah, thank you for that. There's really a lot to say about this era. I mean, as I was digging in more and more, and as I continue to dig in, I mean, this could be a book in itself, just looking at the 1960s and 70s. And the civil rights movement really spurred a generation of photographers of color. This is when we also see some of the first better known African-American photographers coming to the fore. This work by Latinx photographers in the 1960s is really the first time that we see work that's being made with a real ethnic perspective. So photographers taking up the camera as Chicanos or as Puerto Ricans, and really with a deeply political sense of purpose. They were documenting protests against the Vietnam War, against the draft, against police oppression. When I look at these photos, I think so much of what we've been looking at in the news recently. And they were also, advocating. They were advocating for civil rights, for voting rights, equal access to education, to better jobs. And what I found interesting, I grew up in East Los Angeles at the time that George Rodriguez was photographing, and I peripherally at least knew about some of this. I knew about these activities. I didn't really know about the photography, but there were these photographers that were working in Los Angeles, in the Southwest, in the late 60s and 70s. There were also other photographers in New York, primarily Puerto Ricans. They might have been aware of each other, but they weren't really in a shared dialogue. There was really no internet. But I was really interested to see the parallels between these two groups. Let me show you a couple of photographs that are from the Chicano civil rights movement. That movement coalesced around Cesar Chavez, who was the head of the United Farm Workers. He and Dolores Huerta founded the United Farm Workers, which was founded as a struggle to gain union representation for farm workers in California. They were mostly Mexican Americans. They worked for just a few dollars a week and under really grueling conditions, poverty level pay. This movement attracted dozens of photographers to California's Central Valley. They were paid by the UFW, something like $5 a week, and I think some free food. This photograph is by Chris Sanchez, who was one of the most active photographers. Unfortunately, most of his archive was destroyed when he died a few years ago. But I have found examples of his work in some union archives, labor archives, and he was just really all over the place, photographing strikers and the activities of Cesar Chavez. This is another photographer, Ben Garza. He was another one of the key photographers of the movement. You know, as in the last image, you see the flag, the huelga, the strike flag with that eagle. That eagle symbol, as you know, Laura, comes from the Mexican flag, and it even has an earlier root. It's based in an Aztec symbol of the eagle, of strength and of bravery. So this became the symbol of the United Farm Workers, and that flag is ubiquitous. And I want to add here that, you know, I mentioned earlier that the 60s is when photographers began to get well known. Prints began to go up in value and collected, but not this photography. This photography was very mission driven, and these photographers were making their work strictly out of the need to document what they saw going on and to advance the work of social justice. And also, you know, this is the way these photographs were seen. These are copies of El Malcriado, which was a Chicano labor newspaper, which was basically the organ for the UFW. And I wanted to show you these images in this context because, you know, to really drive home the fact that these images were made kind of by and for Chicano people, for these workers. You know, for the first time, it was images like this were being seen by marginalized people. And it was these positive representation of people just like themselves expressing a sense of empowerment. And if we can go to the next slide. So the UFW and its activities were primarily in California's Central Valley, although there were demonstrations in Los Angeles, a big march that went to Sacramento. But these activities became the starting point for a broader social justice movement among Mexican Americans throughout the Southwest. By the end of the 1960s, politically aware Mexican Americans, and really starting with the students, began to refer to themselves as Chicanos, a politically charged, self-legitimizing designation. They were inspired by Chavez and by the farm workers themselves, and they were motivated by this new sense of ethnic and cultural pride. So student and community groups began to organize, and they began to address issues in their urban communities. And one of the big ones was the quality of the schools. So in the late 1960s, there were these huge walkouts from just about every high school and even middle schools in East Los Angeles. I was a little too young to take part in this, but I was very aware of this. This movement really galvanized the Chicano community and really became the starting point for a much broader awareness of civil rights among Mexican Americans.
This is so interesting, Elizabeth, that is part of your own experience growing up. So powerful.
So yeah, let me just show you one more image. As I mentioned, I was young when all this was going on, but it was really close to home. This is another photograph by George Rodriguez. One of the things that took place when I was growing up was the Chicano moratorium, was this massive demonstration in 1970. It was against the draft, and it ended in really heavy-handed police tactics. In fact, 3 people died that day. One was Ruben Salazar, who was a pioneering journalist. He was one of the first Mexican-American journalists who had been hired by the Los Angeles Times. I lived about a half mile away from this, so I remember hearing the sirens that day. You know, I remember seeing this in the news. And what all this really brought home to me, and I think you can see this in George Rodriguez's photo. This is actually another photo of the student walkouts. These kids were putting their lives on the line. And when I look at pictures like this, and I think of, you know, some of the police oppression that's been occurring, you know, not only over the last several months, but over the last years, I just have so much respect for protesters, often for these very young protesters. George Rodriguez was covering all this in East Los Angeles. He had actually been a celebrity photographer in Hollywood, but he decided that he needed to spend more time in East Los Angeles and cover these things. So what this image makes abundantly clear for me is that these students were taking risks when they were simply exercising their First Amendment rights.
Wow. Yes, very, very powerful. And you said that there are parallels also with the East Coast.
Yeah. Yes, in New York. And if we can have the next slide. You know, in New York, so what's happening in the late 1960s and early 1970s is that the Puerto Rican community is really growing. And at the same time, New York is really declining. The blue collar jobs, factory work is leaving the city. Tax revenue is plummeting. Landlords are abandoning buildings, torching buildings for the insurance money. And who does this hit? It hits low-income communities. It hits the communities of people in color, especially in Upper Manhattan, in Brooklyn, in the Bronx. So these neighborhoods are just falling into decay, and city services are just ending. Crime is rising, drug use is rising. So taking a cue from the revolutionary activist organization, the Black Panthers, a group formed in Chicago as well as in New York. They were called the Young Lords, and they were based in Spanish Harlem. And they wanted to address these issues, both through demonstrations and for social projects that they did in their communities. This photo is by Hiram Maristani. He was born in 1945. He still lives in Spanish Harlem. And he was one of the key figures that was active in that time. He started photographing as an adolescent in the 1950s. And I read that he wanted to be a professional photographer. And when he told his mother, her response was, Hiram, there's no such thing as a Puerto Rican photographer. But he persevered, he joined the Young Lords, and he became their official photographer. So he was documenting their daily activities, as well as demonstrations like these. And what's important is that photographers like Hiram, and there are others, but he's definitely one of the most important ones. They were also out in the streets. They were capturing daily life. They were not capturing crime and decay. They wanted to show that Spanish Harlem was this vibrant neighborhood. There was a culture there. This was home to the people that came before their camera. And this photo is just incredible to me. The warmth of these young boys. And Hiram has mentioned that he didn't pose them. They actually just naturally came together this way, all connecting with each other. I want to show you just one more photo by a photographer of this generation. This is Maximo Colon. And he was a ubiquitous photographer around Harlem and really all over New York. He's also still based in Upper Manhattan. He was so active in the 1960s and 70s. He captured the protests, but also celebration. There's often a lot of music and dancing in his work. This photo is of a Puerto Rican cultural festival on the Lower East Side, and it just says so much to me because Colon is documenting the African roots of Puerto Rican culture, and he's expressing a kind of joy and pride in maintaining traditions. So I feel that among all this work that's being made in the late 1960s, these images of pride and of protest, they really go hand in hand. They speak to the vitality of communities, even as they were enduring a lot of hardship in those days.
Yes, wow. And of course, this is very close to my heart. I love it, this image. Your book highlights the importance of so many women photographers, and I have to really applaud that, and it could not have been easy. Your earliest Latinx photographer is female. You mentioned her earlier, Fannie Guadalupe Vallejo. And since women's history and contributions to art and society have been silenced, erased, ignored, tell us, how were you able to find, excavate their contributions and find images?
Yeah, thank you. It really was a challenge. I think that women's voices have been doubly marginalized, especially, there was a period when men truly dominated the photography world. And then, as Latinas, as people of color, that was also a challenge. If we go back to a couple of generations, looking into the 1960s, 70s, if you look at my chapter on civil rights movements, it does focus on male photographers. But then there's this one figure, if I can have the next slide, a female photographer who dedicated her entire career to social justice issues. This is Maria Varela. She was born in 1940, and she began as a civil rights activist as a high school student in Chicago, working for Catholic social justice organizations. She worked in Los Angeles for a period for the newspaper La Raza that I mentioned earlier. And she didn't take up photography until she went to Selma, Alabama. She worked with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC. This was the more radical branch of civil rights movements in the South that were working to end racial segregation. She started as an organizer with SNCC. She was working on voting rights. But she decided that, she really wanted to document what she saw. She wanted to use photography to educate and to inspire. So she basically taught herself. She got some tips from other photographers who were kind of out in the field working there. But she became a really socially committed photographer. First in the South, as I mentioned, in Alabama, and then she eventually, came to the Southwest. Maria Varela represents, for me, the kind of photographer whose name should be much better known. I think that on the East Coast, there are also some other photographers, but a lot of these women who were working in New York in the 1970s, they really weren't able to sustain careers. I've seen them documented in old brochures of El Museo del Barrio from exhibitions that they had in the 1970s. I see these names around occasionally. Some of them were very difficult to find, but one figure who I think was able to sustain her career is this figure, Perla de Leon. This is a photograph by her from 1980. She actually got her start with Enfoco, the organization that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. She was teaching photography, teaching to young people. And she was also a public school teacher in the South Bronx. So her work is so interesting because she was working in the South Bronx when you can see it was absolutely a site of devastation. She talks about entire blocks of apartment buildings being reduced to rubble. She talks about buildings being torched by arsonists, where you could walk block after block and see things like this. But this was her neighborhood as well. She was coming every day. She knew these kids, and she really wanted to focus on children. This neighborhood was their home. She once said, everybody would capture the fires, but I wanted to capture the life that was there, the spirit of the kids, their resilience. She was really making this kind of work when few other photographers, especially women photographers, were venturing into the South Bronx. Belatedly, decades later, she's become better known. Her photographs have been in major exhibitions. The work is now being collected by the Smithsonian. So this is kind of precisely the kind of thing that I think needs to happen, because if it's not, then some of these photographers, the work does become lost, which is unfortunate, because it's really important. If we move on to recent decades, the situation really changes, because there's a substantial generation of Latina photographers who have received much more recognition and exposure. I could mention several, but I really want to single out Laura Aguilar, who's a very important figure in the realm of Chicanx art. Laura lived from 1959 to 2018, and she used photography to forthrightly examine issues of gender and her multiple identities as brown, female, queer, and Mexican American. In an early series of work, let me just take a glass of water, please. Excuse me. In an early series of work, Latina Lesbian, she combined text with portraits to make powerful statements about women who at the time were doubly marginalized, both as lesbian and women and as Mexican Americans. Her photos really contain a performative element. Her subjects, as you can see, they really have a role in how they want to be portrayed. And I think that this kind of work clearly suggests that they were resisting assimilation, resisting mainstream ways of life, but she wanted to show the validity of their lifestyles. This is Aguilar's 1990 Three Eagles Flying, which I see as among the most powerful works in the corpus of Latinx art in general. As you can see, the artist depicts herself nude. She's covered with a flag, the flag of Mexico, and also by the American flag, and she's bound by ropes. So she's giving literal expression to a dual cultural heritage that overwhelms her sense of identity. What is most telling is the way that Aguilar has used the Mexican flag here. I showed you that flag earlier in the photos from the 1960s of the civil rights protesters in California. They used the eagle in the UFW flag as a sign of strength. Here, Aguilar uses the flag as a personal symbol her name is actually comes from the Spanish for eagle, Águila, and her name is Aguilar. So there's a lot of symbolic importance to this work, but it's also just incredibly frank. Laura just put herself out there. She was very vulnerable, and she used photography to talk about her identity, to talk about some of the most difficult elements of identity. So this is an incredibly powerful work. She also became fairly well known. Not long before her passing, she had her first museum exhibition in Los Angeles, an exhibition which is still traveling around the United States. I understand that the Getty Museum has also acquired a large body of work. So, this is in contrast to so many other earlier Latina photographers, but in my mind, this history of women photographers, in Latinx photographers is still incomplete. I think there's a lot more research that needs to be done.
Right, and it's still being written and being made, right? So it's
absolutely,
always...
yeah. There's a lot of incredible younger photographers that I was able to include a few in the book.
And they keep on coming up, I'm sure. I wanted to talk about and ask you, you have a beautiful photograph of your grandmother in the book, taken around the 1930s, here it is.
Yes.
Please tell us about your own personal journey in writing this book and researching it, because it just seems like this is also so close to your heart. And also I want to remind people that they can type in questions in the ask a question section. But tell us about your personal
journey. Well, a few years ago, my uncle, Richard Estrada, who's the family historian, he sent me this photo, and it floored me. I had never seen a picture of my grandmother so young. I knew her, of course, as a much older woman. She is standing on the patio of this house that doesn't exist anymore, but it's not that far from where I grew up. A house not that different from this one, a wooden bungalow. And it just struck me so emotionally. And I know that, for you and for the photographers in this book and all of us, we're all struck when we see these photos that represent our family, across time and across place. And a lot of the photographers, when I interviewed them, so many of them talked about the photos that they found in shoeboxes or in old family albums, really being their first encounter with photography. And many of them said it was that first encounter is what led them to want to study photography and to make the decision to become photographers. So for me, this photograph, and as I mentioned, all these other photographs that we find in these photo albums, they just demonstrate the power of photography to connect us across generations. And I think that's as true for these great works of photography as for the photos that we take for ourselves, for our family photos. So many photographers in the book referred in one way or another to family and these old photo albums that I decided to dedicate a chapter in the book to that theme. And here I want to especially mention Cuban Americans, because they come to the medium with a special history of exile and of separation. Many were born in Cuba. They came to the United States either as infants or children, and so they've experienced a rupture from place, a rupture from family. There is this sense in their work of the aquí y allá, the here and there, and they often deal with that theme in their work. So if we look at this slide, this is by Eduardo Munoz, who was born in Havana in 1964. He came to the United States as a young adult. He's now based in Austin. And he has focused his work on the psychological dimensions of exile. He's devised this style, this disjunctive, this visual style with using photo montages of photos taken at different times and places. So in this photo from 2002, he merges a couple of photographs. Visible outside the car window, you see the artist himself, this young man with his outstretched arms in this pose of carefree exuberance. He's posing right on the Havana coast. And then in the car's rear view window, you see the smaller image of the ocean. The ocean becomes this very poignant symbol of separation and loss. So for me, this photograph is it's literally a rear view. It represents a past that he longs for. We go to the next photo by Karen Miranda de Rivadeneira. it's another constructed photo. This is a staged scene. And I think that the fact that these photographers are using these devices of staging or constructing, it really points to their desire to talk about memory and the need to reconstruct memories, to reconstruct kind of what they long for. Karen was originally from Ecuador. She's now based in New York, although she goes back and forth. This is a really interesting series. There's several images in the series where she staged these remembrances from her youth with her mother and herself and her siblings reenacting things that happened, you know, a decade or two or two ago in their lives. So here we see an adult Karen in a park with her mother, remembering a time when she visited the park as a child with her mother as a way of trying to deal with her fear of iguanas. And then I want to show you one more by Cristina Fernandez, who's Chicano based in Los Angeles. These are from a series of half dozen photos entitled Maria's Great Expedition, who made this series in the mid-1990s. The series is a narrative. It's actually, if you were to see it in a museum setting, it's sort of a museological display that starts with a map that outlines the migration of her grandmother from Mexico to California. And it talks about key moments in her grandmother's life. So this is a maternal history from Mexico to the United States. And one of the things that I love about the series, and you see this, I think it's the earliest and the latest photograph in the series, is that she used photo processes from different times. So it's both this history of a family and of an individual, and as well as alluding to the history of photography.
It's really amazing. Yeah. The final chapter, we sent the photograph of your grandmother. You also discuss social media and Instagram. How do you connect these?
Right. All right. So if we could look at the next slide. So what I think that all the images in the book show us is that there's simply a desire to see reflections of our own selves and our place in the world. I think photography is a way of leaving our mark in the world. It's to show that our lives matter. There's this great Chicana artist based in the Bay Area, Amalia Mesa Baines, and she once wrote about how our art functions as a collective memory, as an alternative chronicle. And, you know, without our voices and without efforts to have these voices heard, these perspectives would remain invisible. They'd be lost. So I end the book with an artist who uses social media in a way to kind of echo Mesa Baines' words, because this artist, Guadalupe Rosales, has found a means to create an alternative chronicle, and it functions as a collective memory. And through Instagram, she's making these voices known more than ever before. So this is a screenshot from Veteranas en Rucas. This is the Instagram feed of Guadalupe Rosales. She started this in 2015. She started it as a kind of a more personal archive of the party crew scene of the mid-1990s that she took part in, and she wanted to create an archive of that. But it has grown incredibly into this crowdsourced archive of Latinx youth culture in Southern California. Rosales now has over 250,000 followers. And this suggests for me not only the power of Instagram, but the desire among countless groups to see reflections of our own lives presented and shared. And, you know, for me, the photographers that I cover have deployed their talents towards documenting and constructing images of their own communities that have been ignored. They've been under-recognized, misrepresented. These, as I mentioned at the beginning, these are voices that have been absent from the visual history of the United States. And ultimately, I see their work as playing a crucial role in the process of constructing and imagining a more equitable, a more inclusive, and a more diverse American history.
Yes. That's why I think this book is so very important. And I could go on and I could look at images and reread the chapters, because everyone in the audience can tell, there is so much embedded in all of the images. So not only is the image telling an important story, but the people behind the camera. And I also really appreciate how you discuss family archives and the importance of being being the keepers and custodians of our own histories, and how also we owe a lot of this history to our families who,
Absolutely.
just on a personal level, just for love, have been keeping these shoeboxes filled with photographs, with notes behind them. I know my grandmother certainly left a bunch of those, and I appreciate them so much. And but it's time for questions. Okay, we have a couple of questions that are very good. We have a question, let's take them in order. We have a question, Katy Partida. Wait, no, let's start with from bottom up. Let's start, this is actually something that is important to mention. From Judy Townsend, Ms. Ferrer, could you tell us about your choice and use of the term Latinx? Thank you.
Okay. Yes, I had a feeling that would come. Yeah, it's for me. It's important to talk about it and to understand it, because our community has we have called ourselves so many different. We refer to ourselves in so many different ways, and there have been so many names that have been imposed upon us. For example, Hispanic, which is a word that is still used. That actually came as a federal designation in the census. We have various ethnic categories that we use: Mexican American, Chicano, Puerto Rican, Boricua, Cuban American. We have had Hispanic. Even before Hispanic, there was Spanish, Latino, and now Latinx. The reason that I use Latinx, it's really simply because it's a gender neutral term. And I think that it is more embracing of all of the community. So it doesn't break us down into, a kind of a male-female binary. And it's also very forward-looking, I think. And I think it's a term that came from our community. For me, Latinx is, it's not only about ethnicity, about a specific ethnicity, or it's not only about skin color, because we can be white, we can be black, we can be brown. We're mostly all mixtures. But it's really about the fact that we, as Latinx people, which also means people of Latin American heritage, we all share a history of being colonized. And because of that colonization, we all share a history of marginalization. And so many of us have histories of displacement and exile. So I thought it was important to bring all of these groups together to talk about what we share. And also to talk about our differences. If you look in the book, there's a great diversity in the book as well. A lot of different points of views and themes and concerns.
It's true. It's true. And in your preface, you also discuss the term Latinx in your book very well. So it's also a great resource for a lot of people who ask that question. Thank you, Judy, for asking that question. And then we have another question that is actually like 3 questions.
Okay.
So I think the first one has been answered. What was the genesis for this project? So that you've answered. How did you ask for help? Was it difficult? And then that same person has another question, which is, what is your next project? If there were no restrictions at all, knowledge, time, geography, dinero, power, what would it be? What would that dream project be? So there's 2 questions.
Okay, well, about asking for help. What I found is that people were incredibly generous. People were excited about the idea. Photographers wanted to tell me about their work, pull out their portfolios and, give me presentations, answer questions. It was pretty incredible. It was only my time limitations I was not able to, visit every historical society or do research on these early portrait studios that sprung up in, Arizona and Texas border and in the 1890s. There's lots of little threads that I still could have pulled and gotten at for more information. But when I told people about the project, and one of the places that was especially helpful, university archives were always very generous with their time and information. I amassed a lot of information, and I'm very grateful to the photographers, as I mentioned, to widows and surviving spouses, partners, other curators. Some of these photographers have had a catalog or a museum, a university gallery exhibition. So it's not like there's nothing out there. It just needed to all be put together. And then there are many of these photographers who have had almost next to nothing. But as I say, this work should continue. I will probably continue it, but I hope that this book is also read in university classes, and that these photographers become the subjects of college papers and PhD dissertations. I don't know what the next project is. I've been thinking about that myself. I love to write. After I haven't written for a while, I get really itchy, and I'm thinking about maybe doing a biography. I'm also thinking about doing more about the civil rights era, but I don't know yet. Time will tell.
Thank you. That question was from Partida. And we have another question from Martha Cohen-Rowe. This book is such an important chronology, especially for younger generations. How do you think your book can play a role in today's socio-political situation?
Thank you for that question. I just think it's so important for all creative contributions to be recognized. I think that what's happening right now, both with Black Lives Matter conversations and and forms of protest, and also with decolonized museum type projects that are taking place, and is that more people want to sit at the table. More people want to be able to make decisions. There needs to be a greater diversity of voices in the cultural world, whether it's coming from the point of view of curators, critics, museum directors, the artists who get their work shown on the walls. It's happening. We've made a lot of progress since the 1960s, but clearly there's still a lot of progress to be made. So, I hope that the next time a major museum decides to undertake a huge survey of the history of American photography, or one of the largest publishers in the United States decides to come up with a major book on the history of photography in the United States, these voices are in there. I think that that's when this book will become successful, when these voices are part of this greater history of American photography or history of art.
I think your book will do that successfully, contribute in that way. I'm sure of it. And I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. And Elizabeth Ferrer, thank you. This was incredible. I could go on all night, and if you all want to join us, we can do another Zoom some other day.
Thank you, Laura.
And always great listening to you and speaking about your work is fascinating. Thank you so much, and thank you also, Town Hall Seattle, for this amazing evening and event.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both so much. This has been such a treat. I want to thank you both for your work. Thank you, Elizabeth, for your work on this book. And Josh, if you can open the chat, I just want to put in your website, Laura, just so that people have access to that as well and can go experience your work as well. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Audience, our friends and audience, people we know and don't know, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, thank you so much.
I want to encourage everyone to pre-order the book here tonight with Third Place Books. Support the local bookstore. If you want to follow more Town Hall events, you can check out our calendar online, or you can follow this Crowdcast channel. And please do go check out Laura's work. I put the link in the chat there. So thank you both so much again. This was such a wonderful evening, and hope to see you sometime soon again in person, perhaps. Have a great night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.